We're talking about the days when even the wind blew with fear in the deep-rooted lands of Europe. A time when people prayed to see the sun in the daytime, and the nights were enveloped in silent terror. It was a time when a story was whispered on every street corner. The plague, like a black snake, roamed the land, devouring everything in its path. But it was not just a disease. It was one of the closing curtains of the old world. Imagine you are living in 14th century Europe. Crowded streets, cobbled roads, and the hum of marketplaces. But these familiar sights are suddenly shrouded in a bleak silence. The wailing from the houses has silenced the city squares, once filled with laughter, like a graveyard. And the only thing that breaks the silence is the echo of those unfortunate bells. Another body has fallen. Another life has been extinguished. The Black Plague was eating away not only at people's bodies, but also at their souls. Families were torn apart. Neighbors suspected each other. Prayers were lost in the sky. Neither the armor of kings nor the blessings of popes could protect against this invisible enemy. This is a story not only of a pandemic, but also of the resistance of the human spirit. And now I will take you back to those days, to where it all began, to the first ports where Genoese merchants arrived with their plague-laden ships. Get ready, because this is the story of Europe's descent into darkness and its rebirth. Dark times often start with small sparks, don't they? That's exactly how the story of the Black Plague began, a spark. But this time it was a spark that turned into a fire. This deadly journey began in the vast steppes of the East, followed the dusty paths of the Silk Road, and finally reached the gates of Europe. But this was not just the story of a disease, but of the crumbling walls of the old world. On a warm autumn day in 1347, Genoese merchants' ships leaving the Black Sea port of Keffe were carrying something much more to Europe, an invisible, silent killer. Legend has it that Keffe was a strategic trading port under Genoese control at the time. But this port loaded ships not only with spices, silk and grain, but also with the harbingers of death, black rats and the fleas they carried on their backs. The silence that enveloped the port of Keffe was in fact an echo of the siege by the Mongol armies. During this siege, plague had begun to break through the ranks of the Mongol army. And it was here that a terrifying moment occurred. The Mongols decided to use the plague as a weapon. They spread the disease by catapulting infected corpses over the city walls. The hum of commerce that once echoed through the streets of Keffe had been replaced by the silence of death. When the Genoese merchants managed to escape from this besieged port, they did not realize that they were carrying with them not only their goods, but also the Black Plague that would ravage Europe for centuries to come. The ships set sail, and as they sailed the blue waters of the Mediterranean, death was their companion. In this way, Europe was preparing to meet one of the greatest catastrophes in its history. Imagine the lively, noisy ports of Italy. The gold-leafed canals of Venice and the cobbled streets of Genoa echoed with the voices of merchants from all over the Mediterranean. But these ports would turn into death traps by the end of 1347. When the Genoese ships first reached the Sicilian port of Messina, the inhabitants of the town were struck by a strange fear. Not only was there an unusual silence on these ships, but also the bodies of dead sailors lying on the decks. Those who were alive were dying. Blackened bumps on their faces, traces of pain on their bodies. The port of Messina closed quickly, but it was too late. The disease was already entrenched. Genoese merchants, due to the nature of trade, continued to reach Venice, Naples, and other Italian ports. Each port became a new starting point for death. Rats landed on land from the ships. Fleas spread this invisible enemy they carried to humans. Within days, the first cases emerged, and within weeks, the cities were thrown into chaos. In places like Venice, the heart of trade, the epidemic spread quickly. At first, people thought it was the wrath of God. Merchants, pilgrims, peasants, no one escaped death. Even a trading giant like Genoa was brought to its knees. These port cities, which had shaped Mediterranean trade for centuries, had become the center of the epidemic. Houses were abandoned, churches were filled with prayers, but death had overcome even the prayers. But was this dance of death limited to the ports? Let's dig a little deeper to see how quickly the epidemic spread across the land in the Europe of that time. Roads, marketplaces, and towns. Death was leaving a trail around every corner. Are you ready to follow these tracks? Ah, my dear friends, the darkness of those years hangs over us like a shadow as we recount the first great wave of the Black Death in Europe. This is the story not just of a disease, but of a deep wound in the heart of a civilization. This catastrophe, which lasted from 1347 to 1351, filled the earth with the dead and darkened the skies with mourning. But there was not only death in this story, there was also fear, despair, and the test of the human spirit. It all started in the port of Messina in Sicily, you remember. The disease spread like wildfire from port to port. But this fire was not limited to coastal towns. It spread across the vast lands of Europe, from cobbled streets to forests, from villages to palaces. Trade routes and human mobility were the plague's allies. Every caravan, every ship, every marketplace was another step towards death. At that time, people were not prepared to deal with this invisible enemy. When the first symptoms appeared, the number of hands raised in hope and prayer increased. But death spared no one. Mankind's pleas to the gods could not stop the silent advance of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The plague turned every person it touched into a pale corpse in just a few days. By 1348, the disease had grown like a dark cloud in the heart of Europe. Florence, with its beautiful city, was the center of art and commerce. But that year, life gave way to death on the streets of Florence. The music and laughter of daily life was replaced by the silence of funeral processions. The city's stone sidewalks were littered with the bodies of those who had died of the disease. It was no different in the great lands of France, Germany, and England. The crowded markets of London soon turned into burial grounds. People were unable to find grave sites to bury their relatives. Mass graves were dug, each containing tens or even hundreds of bodies. The church bells had never stopped ringing, but now they only rang to bid farewell to the dead. In some places, the number of dead was so great that even funerals were abandoned. Priests could no longer keep up with the prayers. In desperation, people left the bodies in front of their houses or carried them into the forest. But how much hope could there be for the living at a time when even the dead could not find peace? And of course, in these dark days, not only bodies but also minds were crushed under the weight of this catastrophe. People struggled to understand the cause of the Black Death, sometimes blaming the stars, sometimes evil spirits. The witch hunt against the Jews was a painful reminder of what fear could lead to. Everyone was looking for a culprit, but the real culprit was a killer too small for human eyes to see, carried on the backs of fleas. Ah, those were the years when the first great wave of the Black Death swept across Europe. Societies would never be the same again. Fields went uncultivated, trade ground to a halt, and even the churches were powerless. But the scars left by the Black Death were not limited to death. This great catastrophe also irrevocably changed human history. So, my dear friends, how did Europe recover after this great catastrophe? How did people struggle to rebuild what they had lost? Let's take a look at the aftermath of these dark days in the next chapter. Ah, the great cities. Names like London, Paris, and Florence were once shining symbols of human dignity, art, commerce, and culture. But when the Black Death came, these cities not only became mere places of stone and earth, they lost their souls. So much so that these once glorious cities felt the cold breath of death in every corner. In London, in the crowded and bustling streets of those times, the marketplaces were overflowing. People's voices echoed along the Thames, merchants praised their wares, artists entertained the public in the squares. But by 1349, these sounds were replaced by a deep silence. The streets were no longer filled with people bargaining, but with corpses waiting to be moved. More than half of London's population perished in the merciless grip of the Black Death. Death knew neither rich nor poor. Even the palaces of the lords could not be cleansed of the stench of rotting corpses. Paris was the intellectual center of Europe. This city, full of universities and cathedrals, was where science and faith met. But when the plague came to Paris, this intellectual center was drowned in despair. People blamed the stars, prayed to God, and sometimes declared their neighbors enemies as they tried to understand the cause of the disease. The beautiful streets of Paris were now a city not only of fear, but of mass graves. Gates opened, bodies piled one on top of the other, and the sky grew darker every day. And Florence, Florence, the darling of art and commerce, Dante's land, Michelangelo's inspiration. But in 1348, the light of Florence gave way to the darkness of the Black Death. Almost 2/3 of Florence's population died of disease. The city, once known for its beauty, was now a ruin where only the sounds of gravediggers echoed. Families disappeared one by one, while the sound of bells rang endlessly. The crowded streets of Florence seemed to be filled with ghosts instead of people. The collapse of these cities was not just physical destruction. People's hopes were also buried in graves. The marketplaces were no longer filled with goods, but with the silence of death. The hands that prayed in the cathedrals had stopped, even waiting for an answer from the sky. Would cities be able to recover from this epidemic? But dear friends, this horror in the cities did not go unechoed in the countryside. The peasants, with the same hands that had grown bountiful crops in their fields, were now only sowing the seeds of death. In the countryside, agricultural production came to a standstill. Fields were waiting to be planted, but there was no one left to cultivate them. The plague hit the villages as cruelly as the cities. Farms were empty and villages were silent. But how would rural life in Europe recover from this devastation? Would the villages be able to revive? Or would humanity continue to be crushed by this catastrophe? Let's look for answers to these questions together in the next chapter. My dear friends, the horror of the Black Death shook not only bodies, but minds and souls as well. For people, everything had to have an explanation, didn't it? For centuries, praying hands in the presence of God had trusted in the church and found a spiritual harbor in times of trouble. But the Black Death reached the sacred walls of the church and shattered the order inside. Priests and monks began to dwindle among the people, not by fleeing the plague, but by being destroyed by the plague itself. The church worked hard to heal the sick and give them hope, yes, but it was helpless in the face of the plague. People gathered in churchyards, prayed and celebrated masses, but death was still close at hand. Priests were tired of blessing the dead. Grave diggers could not keep up with the mass burials. Some clergy abandoned their duties in fear, but the people did not forgive this cowardice. If even God's chosen servants succumb to this calamity, what is our hope? He asked. And the papacy in Rome, that great authority, the unshakable fortress of the people, suddenly began to crack. Even the popes, considered God's representatives on earth, were silent and helpless in the face of the Black Death. Criticism of papal authority grew rapidly. Some claimed that the catastrophe was caused by the sins of the Church. As the papacy lost centuries of power and credibility, the seeds of popular revolt began to grow. People were turning their backs on the Church, looking for a new source of hope. It was a crisis that reverberated not only in the heart of the Black Death, but also in the heart of Western Christianity. End of study. But my friends, when one is in despair, the search for a more powerful explanation never ends. As the church weakened, other voices began to be heard. And one of the loudest of these voices was raised by the people who roamed the streets with whips on their backs. People for whom faith had turned into madness. As the clutches of the Black Death ravaged every sector of society, some could only explain the horror with the wrath of God. This is a punishment, they said. Sinful humanity deserved this catastrophe. And so flagellant groups emerged, condemning themselves to suffering in the hope of atoning for their sins. These groups traveled from city to city with whips in their hands and deep wounds on their backs. The pain and despair on their faces was an expression of pleading for God's forgiveness, not only for themselves, but for all humanity. Those who saw them on the road would recoil, first in surprise, then in fear. Everywhere they stopped, the flagellants organized ceremonies, prayed a mass, and whipped their backs until they bled. God must see us, they would say, must see us and take away this pain. But, dear listeners, this movement soon ceased to be a matter of faith and became a social menace. Some flagellant groups blamed Jews, witches, or other sinful groups for God's wrath. They spread fear and chaos among the population and incited violence. Even the church was disturbed by this movement and eventually banned the activities of these groups. But the frenzy of the flagellants left scars as deep as the plague. But was the spiritual vacuum created by the Black Death only filled with chaos and violence? Or would humanity sow the seeds of a new awakening after this dark period? In the next chapter, let's witness together the winds of change that followed these difficult years. Dear friends, the Black Death did not only consume bodies. It filled minds with dark fears and hearts with hatred. As people struggled to find an explanation for this unspeakable catastrophe, they searched for a scapegoat to shoulder the responsibility. Drowning in the vortex of helplessness, society silenced the voices of reason and compassion and listened to the poisonous whispers of fear. And so, all over Europe, Jews were portrayed as the cause of this catastrophe. Some said that the Jews had deliberately poisoned the wells and thus spread the plague. These rumors spread quickly and fueled public anger, but these claims were an excuse for desperation, not evidence. For centuries, Jews had been seen as the other in many societies, ostracized and prejudiced. The chaos created by the Black Death set the stage for these animosities to explode. In cities across Europe, the fire of fear and anger turned into pogroms. In Strasbourg, Germany, an attack on Jews in 1349 was written in the dark pages of history in blood. A crowd gathered in the town square, looted Jewish neighborhoods, murdered people and burned hundreds alive. Jewish tombstones were smashed, synagogues destroyed. Hatred did not even spare holy places. These massacres were not limited to Strasbourg. Similar tragedies took place in major centers such as Mainz, Cologne, and Barcelona. During this period of desperate subjugation of the Jews, some accepted conversion to escape death. Unfortunately, even this often could not protect them. Some left their land and sought safer places to find a haven. Countries like Poland and Lithuania, in particular, were more tolerant of Jews, and this wave of immigration paved the way for the establishment of strong Jewish communities in these regions. But this process has left behind burnt villages, destroyed lives, and indelible pain. My dear listeners, these horrific events inflicted a great wound not only on the Jewish people, but also on human dignity. The shame of these massacres remained a part of history for centuries as people recovered from the devastation of the Black Death. But now I leave you with a question. How did societies after the Black Death leave this dark period behind and reshape themselves? A new world was about to be born, but the birth would be painful and difficult. In the next episode, we will explore the traces of this transformation together. My dear friends, the claw of the Black Plague tore not only the lives of men like a monster, but also the souls of Europe. The merciless sword of this plague mowed down more than a third of the continent. People woke up one morning to realize that only death now echoed in the silence of their villages. Squares overflowing, marketplaces humming with commerce, village squares echoing with joyful conversations. They all fell silent, as if never to return. When the first wave of the Black Plague swept across Europe, people were completely unprepared for the terrible disease. Death was so sudden and widespread that most of the population died within a few years. But death didn't just take things from people. It also left a huge void. Villages were completely abandoned, fields were left unplowed, and houses turned into cold shells, bearing the memories of their inhabitants. A traveler in Europe at that time would often encounter empty and ruined villages, houses with windows that opened into black cavities, roads overgrown with weeds, water wells with rotten water. It was as if the heart of the continent had stopped. From Florence to Paris, from London to Prague, it was the same story. The epidemic had hit not only the countryside, but also the big cities. The crowds gathered in the city squares had disappeared. The guilds had run out of workers, and the shops had locked their doors. The existence of guilds and artisan associations was shaken, and many crafts were on the verge of extinction. In some places, even the continuation of certain trades, such as carpenters, tailors, or blacksmiths, was in jeopardy. But the rural collapse was far more devastating. Europe's agricultural production came to a near standstill, as most of the people living in the villages were killed by the pandemic. Imagine, fields that once overflowed with fertility were now pastures and animals were left unattended. The owners of large estates were unable to cultivate their land because they had lost their servants. This is why many feudal landowners were on the brink of collapse. Food shortages remained a major problem not only for those who survived the disease, but also in the years after death. Try to visualize the destruction of a village. Where once children ran merrily along the roads, now only the howling of the wind could be heard. The fields were without crops and the gardens neglected. In the village church, no one rang the bells anymore. Even the priests had fallen victim to this terrible epidemic. And sometimes a traveler could not even find a single survivor in a single village. It was a silence that witnessed the death not only of individuals, but also of society. But dear listeners, isn't every collapse a harbinger of a rebirth? The Black Plague radically changed not only the population of Europe, but also its social and economic structure. Fields emptied, guilds weakened, but at the same time the foundations of the feudal order were shaken. Imagine then what kind of world might have taken shape in the aftermath of this great catastrophe. Would societies be able to rise from the ashes of destruction? In our next episode, we will explore the social and economic transformation that followed the Black Plague. My dear friends, the Black Plague not only took lives and shattered the souls of societies, it also brought with it a great wave of change that shook the foundations of the economy. In the wake of the plague, Europe's countryside lost almost all its vitality. Fields that had once overflowed with fertility were now pastures for stray animals, and peasants were left with only empty houses and abandoned villages. Most of the serfs, the cornerstones of the feudal order, had been killed by the epidemic. The few surviving serfs gained great self-confidence because they had become indispensable to the landowners. Imagine that the serfs, who had previously accepted heavy taxes and almost slavery, now became demanding. Landowners needed labor to cultivate their fields, harvest their crops, and maintain their farms. Unfortunately, with the population decimated by disease, it was impossible to find laborers. The lack of working hands brought Europe's rural economy to its knees. Landowners called upon the serfs, who had once feared them, and competed to offer them better conditions. This change caused the centuries-old feudal order to crack. Gradually, the serfs began to feel less oppressed, and sometimes even to break free from the shackles of slavery. But this was only the beginning. These dramatic changes in the countryside heralded major economic imbalances. The manors were now forced to turn not only to serfs, but also to wage laborers to cultivate their fields. But this increased production costs and further accelerated economic collapse. Europe was in the grip not only of an epidemic, but also of the economic and social chaos it had spawned. Who could have imagined that the feudal order could be so easily shaken? But, my friends, the effects of the Black Plague would leave deep scars, not only in the villages, but also in the cities. In Europe, in the aftermath of the pandemic, the number of survivors had dwindled, but the need for people to work had increased exponentially. Here, for the first time, a world emerged in which the ordinary worker had bargaining power. On farms, in workshops, and in cities, the demand for labor rose so high that workers began to demand higher wages for their labor. Centuries of economic equilibrium were upset, and the price of everything changed. Serfs, who had once worked almost for free, or low-paid laborers, had become a luxury. What about prices? This is where things became even more complicated. The stoppage of production during the pandemic and the empty fields drove up the price of grain and other staples. In Europe, buying a loaf of bread could become so expensive that a family would have to work for days. But this economic shift affected not only food prices but also luxury goods. The prices of trade goods such as silk, spices, and precious metals also skyrocketed as trade routes were blocked by disease and production declined. But, my friends, the economic changes were not just crises. This new order created an opportunity for workers. Those who survived were freer to get paid for their labor. Guilds gained strength because the demand for artisans increased, just like the demand for agricultural workers. Artisans and merchants sought new trade routes and markets. As Europe's economic structure changed, this change slowly began to revitalize cities, but this balance was too fragile to be restored for many years. So, dear listeners, what do you think was the impact of these economic changes on the social structure? Was Europe ready to take the next big step? As the working class gained power, serfs were emancipated, and trade gained a new lease of life. In the next installment, we will explore together the new social order and cultural awakening in the wake of the Black Plague. Wait, my friends, because I have many more stories to tell. Ah, my dear friends, the shadow of the Black Plague has not only destroyed lives, but also centuries of order. The feudal system was like the blood that flowed through the veins of Europe, where lords ruled over their lands and serfs gave them life through the sweat of their brow. But the Black Plague shook the foundations of this order so violently that the feudal structure, which had once seemed unshakable, suddenly began to crumble. Imagine vast tracts of land were left uncultivated. Peasants either died in the plague or abandoned their homes in the hope of a better life. Landowners were more desperate than ever before. The decline of peasants virtually wiped out the labor force, one of the cornerstones of the feudal order. Landowners competed with each other to keep the few remaining serfs or laborers. This competition gave rise to something the peasants could never have imagined before: demands. Yes, dear listeners, now the serfs were demanding more freedom and better living conditions, not just a drop of bread and some protection. For some, this was the first sign of the collapse of feudalism. With no one to work their fields, the lords realized the fragility of the order they had always relied on. Serfs did not have to be tied to their land as before. Now the lords had to lure them with more freedom and better living conditions in order to find workers. This seriously affected both agricultural production and the economic power of the lords. These men, who had once ruled like kings over their lands, were now forced to submit to the demands of the serfs. The chains of feudalism were cracking with the lash of the Black Plague. But, my friends, this upset not only the landowners but also the social and economic structure of Europe. The increasing self-confidence and decreasing dependence of the serfs began to break down the rural hierarchy. Moreover, this change triggered a major transformation not only among peasants, but also in cities and along trade routes. The weakening of the feudal order led to a reshaping of economic relations and social classes. It was no longer possible to restore the old order. Europe had to adapt to this new world, including within. But my friends, what would replace this crumbling order? Was society going to build a new order in this period when feudalism was crumbling, or was this chaos a harbinger of bigger problems? Let's meet in the next episode for the answers to these questions, because the legacy of the Black Plague was more than just death and destruction. Let's see what kind of world the innovations born from the wreckage will shape. Ah, my dear friends, it was not only bodies that were lost in the heart of the Black Plague. As the land, towns, and villages were enveloped in death, the souls of the people began to darken. A fear in the eyes and a deep despair in the hearts of people who saw how fragile and helpless life was. The deaths came so quickly and so unexpectedly that they realized that we could never be ready, that no wall, no shield would be enough to protect us from death. In that moment, old beliefs and trust seemed to collapse in an instant. This is not just physical death. but the death of life as a whole and the death of hope. After the epidemic, towns and villages slowly began to recover, but the changes in the mood of the population were challenging even for a sage. People who had previously laughed and laughed merrily, who had lived ordinary lives, were suddenly filled with a sense that everything was transient and uncertain. Many people had lost their trust in the gods, and even the teachings of religion failed to console them. Hesitation. What had God promised them? If even people who have been devoted and worshipful all their lives are suffering and dying in this way, who is left in this world that can be trusted? 3. There were now deep traces of fear in the eyes of the people. Not only the fear of the pandemic, but also the fact that death could happen anywhere at any time, had deeply traumatized people. In the cities, in the villages, there was fear at every step. Doors were shut tightly. Windowsills were covered. Everyone was suspicious of their neighbors, friends, and even family. It made life seem like a joke, with people losing sleep at night and many waking up in the morning to start another day without knowing whether their friends, spouses, or children were alive. And it was this great fear that drove people away from their communities, from each other. Even families became alienated from each other. In many villages and towns, I heard of survivors abandoning their relatives out of fear. Lovers, husbands, and wives were separated. Families didn't even dare to stay together. Many people were focused only on survival, so much so that they were so frightened that they even abandoned their own children. Sadly, once close-knit people were pushed into isolation under the pressure of death. But my friends, was it possible to escape death, to escape fear and despair? No one knew what to believe anymore. The old hopes, the old trust in God and in the afterlife had darkened. People's hearts broke under the burden of a catastrophe so great that they began to see life only as a struggle for survival. But at the end of this dark period, would the spirit of societies be reborn? Or would this fear and despair lead to the dawn of a new era? This question will make the transformation in the next chapter even more interesting. Slowly we will see how the fears and traumas in minds can somehow take shape and affect society. But could there be light at the end of this dark time? Would people shake off their fears and look for a new hope? Ah, my friends, when death casts its dark shadow everywhere, it makes one's heart ache to see what people have given up in their desire to survive. And that darkness is etched in the ground with the name of the Black Plague. As for medicine, at that time in the 14th century, there was not as much confidence in anything, neither in medicine nor in other areas of life, as there is today. Medieval medicine was neither advanced nor based on a single path. Humans were incapable of unlocking the secrets of disease. And unfortunately, this inability was even more pronounced in the face of the Black Plague. Imagine, my friends, at a time when nothing, not even life, was secure, and you were faced with medical people who had no idea how diseases spread, how to cure them. When the plague came, there was great despair among doctors, priests, and the people. There was no solid information about what the Black Plague was, how it was transmitted, or how to treat it. Instead, false beliefs, superstitious fears, and misguided treatments out of compassion proliferated, and the people began to accept every means they tried as a means to survive. At first, medicine was believed to be directly linked to divine authority. Healing had to come from the gods or holy powers. Therefore, prayer sessions for the sick, rituals, bathing in holy water, or touching the bones of saints were the main methods of treatment. But the more we saw that none of these methods worked against the plague, the more desperate the people became. On the other hand, many doctors developed their own methods against this disease and sought some kind of cure. But these doctors were people with very limited knowledge who defined the plague only as an evil. So unfortunately, their initial treatment methods did nothing but spread the disease. Then there were the great disease beliefs of the time. When the Black Plague came, many people believed that this deadly disease was the wrath of God. These mystical ideas dominated rather than the science of medicine. Everyone sought protection from the polluted waters of the river, from the toxic odors in the air, or worse, from the wrath of God. Unfortunately, at the time they were far from understanding that this deadly disease was contagious. In those moments, the horrible smells that spread through the streets of the city, the body of the sick, and the cries of the rotting corpses left the doctors at a loss for what to do. But dear friends, perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of the Black Plague was that it forced the evolution of medicine itself. The deaths came so horribly and so suddenly that people finally began to look for new ways. At first, doctors tried to treat patients with traditional treatment methods. But the rate of transmission of the plague was so high that the old methods became unmanageable. Doctors began to look for different solutions than the herbal concoctions and mystical remedies they had tried in the past to try to prevent the spread of the disease. These new solutions included some of the first sensible ideas, such as not coming into direct contact with the patient's body. Gradually, doctors began to use gloves and masks and treated infected people more carefully. However, at the time, medicine was still lacking the right knowledge. They had no idea what sterilization or antiseptic methods were. In short, while the Black Plague shook the foundations of medicine, it also heralded an era that would force the birth of a new understanding of treatment. At the time, however, medicine's greatest endeavor was far from finding survivors and providing them with the right treatment to survive. Nevertheless, over time, people would develop a new understanding of wellness and health, and perhaps begin to investigate the reasons why diseases are so frightening and deadly. However, we should not forget that this search is still ongoing, and that over time, humanity has learned from the Black Plague and put medicine on a much firmer footing, and perhaps this terrible epidemic laid the foundation for one of the greatest changes in the field of health in human history. But what were the obstacles to the development of medicine as a science? What new paths would people discover in the wake of the Black Plague? And one day, my friends, that terrible darkness ended. But wait, don't rush. As bad as it was, as painful as it was, nothing is over in an instant. For a long time, the Black Plague had cast a shadow over the people, turning their lives upside down. But by 1351, the first great and frightening wave slowly subsided. The eyes of the dead became less visible, the expectation that they might return less perceptible in the air. People suddenly felt as if they could breathe again. But even in that tranquility, things had changed too much to go back to the way they were. As the first great wave of the epidemic receded, each village, each city, each town tried to cling to life again. But oh, my dear friends, the losses were so great. A third of Europe's population, perhaps more, fell to the ground because of this terrible disease. Fields were left empty, labor dwindled, wheels stopped turning. People hoped for a revival in the places they had migrated to, but life had been so traumatized that these losses could not be easily recovered. Yes, we may have emerged from the shadow of death, but the scars it left behind were too deep to ever be erased. Think, my dear friends, How did a peasant or a merchant feel in those days? He who once sowed and reaped in his field, chatted with friends in his town, sold goods in the market, now felt like a nomad. Everything was foreign. The roads, the abandoned towns, the empty villages and old lands, everything had changed. Those old town walls, those old stone streets were like memories. People were forced to live the memories of the dead while coming to terms with what they had lost. There was also the fact that people began to come together, not knowing how they would survive in this new, frightening world. Rich, poor, landowners, serfs, people who once feared each other, now united by the pain of loss. A new order was slowly being born, but this did not mean that the peasants or the workers were going back to the old order. Everything had changed. When the landowner saw that the fields he had once cultivated were now empty, he realized his need for labor. People started working again, but the labor force was sorely lacking. Many landowners realized that the old order, the old feudal structure, no longer worked. That old slavery, that old way of relating, had quickly melted away in the wake of a collapse. Peasants and farmers were therefore a little freer in this new world, and some of the old class walls were slowly breaking down. The vacuum left by the pandemic brought some new opportunities. While landowners were trying to regain a foothold in their settlements, people were looking for new ways of life. Whole towns wanted to revitalize, but this return to life was not easy. Many places tried to carry on with the old habits and the old order, but they had to face the realities of life. Slowly, settlements began to take shape again. However, these recovery efforts did not happen at the same pace for all places. While some areas recovered quickly, others remained cold, abandoned, and restricted. This gave rise to different stories in every corner of Europe. But one thing was clear: life would never be the same again. Yet, my friends, there was one thing that people clung to and kept on living: hope. Every new day, every new sunrise carried them one step further. Maybe the old order was gone, but life went on. Those who were left behind began to rebuild, to dream of their old dreams, their old lives. The silence of a quarter of a century of those years was beginning to give way to a quiet rebirth. But even if people at that time believed that everything was over, even if they had left the old world behind, forgotten their fears and pain, one question remained: how would Europe's future be reshaped in the wake of such devastation? Would the collapse of feudal systems lead to the emergence of a new order, or to another period of darkness? Ah, my friends, one of the cruelest aspects of life is that hope and trust can be shattered in an instant. The year 1351 seemed to be a time when the great wave of the Black Plague had receded, and the deep wounds left by death were beginning to heal somewhat. But in the depths of life, darkness lurked like an unquiet shadow. The silence of death, left behind by the first great outbreak of the epidemic, was again broken by the terrible screams. After resting and waiting like a monster, the Black Plague once again ravaged Europe. Towards the end of the century, the Black Plague returned again. This time, it was as swift and devastating as before. Those left behind felt as if they had woken up from a nightmare. Death was like a shadow, leaving its mark on every step. But there was the old fear, the fear of death that had awakened in the population after the first wave. As the abandoned villages and towns filled up with people again, there was an uneasiness in every step. There was a fear that comes after years of war, disease, and loss. As people hugged each other again, it was as if they lived in fear that a hand could knock them down at any moment. People returned looking older. When the second wave began, the disease blew like an intoxicating wind everywhere. From one village to another, from one town to another, death spread rapidly. Many places were once again filled with rotten bodies. As people tried to hold on to each other again after years of war, death came again. But this second wave was different from the first. The first fear had driven people away from the streets and villages. Now death was waiting around every corner. But the people did not want to take a step back, because they understood how inevitable the disaster they had seen before was. And once again, for the people of Europe, fear and despair became the symbols of this terrible return. Just as in the first wave, peasants continued to go out to their fields, merchants continued to go to their markets, people continued to leave their homes. This time, however, something had changed. There was a hopelessness in people's eyes, a sadness of loss, rather than a fear of loss. On the one hand, there was the struggle for survival. On the other, the cold reality of inevitable death. When I tell you this, my friends, when I think of the people of that time, something very strange indeed comes to my mind. I realize that the Black Plague was not only a physical disease, but also a social wound. In those years, people had to defend not only their bodies, but also their souls. The labor force again dwindled. Towns continued to empty. But somehow social structures also began to change. People lost their old confidence and began to question their old beliefs. This was not only the physical effect of a disease, but also a harbinger of spiritual decline. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the question of whether that third wave would come. The people of Europe lived in anticipation of a new catastrophe at any moment. But no matter how much we try to stare, we can never fully understand. But was there a healing of the public spirit in those years? Was a new world born with a pandemic? Or did they look back and think it was all just a disappointment? As you listen to me, my dear friends, you will realize once again how cruel time is, and you will see history not only as a chain of events, but also as a reflection of a profound state of mind. The Black Plague ravaged Europe, ravaging the land with death, emptying villages and leaving cities in ruins. But as the end of that terrible period approached, something began to emerge. Yes, death was whispering, but life was also whispering somewhere. On the rubble of the Black Plague, the blossoming hope of life began to appear. But this time, everything was different. The Black Plague shook not only the bodies, but also the thoughts, culture, and social fabric of a people. People began to understand the value of life in a different way, as they felt death up close at every moment. In the aftermath of the great catastrophe, out of the destruction and loss, a kind of rebirth began to emerge in different villages, towns, and cities across Europe. A more dynamic, more flexible, and more volatile world began to replace the old order. People have begun to shape their own lives, not as losers, but as steps towards winning again. At first, perhaps the most obvious change was in the economic structure of society. Farmers, artisans, and merchants had suffered heavy losses due to the pandemic. Every aspect of agriculture, production, and trade was weakened. But over time, this vacuum opened up new opportunities in society. It was very interesting to see how people went from a pessimistic view that it was all over to a determination to rebuild. The demand for labor increased because the survivors needed to work and produce more. This new organization of work created a labor force that was freer from serfdom. The weakening of the feudal order allowed individuals to explore their freedoms more But this transformation did not stop at the economic sphere. Social structures also underwent a kind of metamorphosis after the Black Plague. People have developed a much deeper understanding of life. Inequalities in social relations began to be questioned more. The power of the church weakened. People began to seek a lifestyle that was freer, both physically and spiritually, from the dogmas of religion. The old reign of the feudal lords gave way to the rise of commerce, the bourgeoisie, and a new labor force. Cities started to become crowded again, and the seeds of all sorts of innovations were sown there. And my friends, perhaps the most impressive of all these changes has been the cultural awakening. People began to rebuild their intellectual worlds, instead of just focusing on surviving day-to-day life as they used to. Art, philosophy, science, and literature have been revitalized by the rediscovery of old knowledge that was once forgotten. Many people tried to access knowledge that was previously only available to a limited circle. The Black Plague was perhaps the beginning of man's rediscovery of himself. Artists, painters, and sculptors created new works, trying to understand the nature of life and death beyond the old world they thought was dead. In fact, from a new perspective, human history has begun to return to its beginnings. And finally, in this period of rapid change, European society began to reshape itself. One by one, the stones of the old feudal system were shifting, and the new structures that emerged were more democratic and egalitarian. People quickly joined forces to build a world that was not temporary. But behind these revolutionary changes, questions remained. Could the new world really replace the old world? Was society reborn? And would all these changes soon disappear on the dusty shelves of history? And now, my friends, we are faced with another question. Were these changes that came with the rebirth of Europe really the harbinger of a new era, or just a temporary hope?